Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the Battleborn 2025 Gold Medal Longsword match between Jack Gassman and Chris Soohoo. Battleborn happened out in Carson City, Nevada just a week or so ago, and it featured a very nice thing that I wish more tournaments had, which is a best of 3 longsword final, meaning that you didn't just have to win one fight one time, you had to win at least 2 out of 3 of them in order to be the victor. And specifically, I am going to go over the second match between these two fighters. The first match was a little bit messy, and the second match was significantly better, and it featured a lot more adaptations, so it was a lot better for a breakdown. So let's get into it. For our first exchange, we have an absolutely beautiful shield howl from Jack that lands straight into the neck of Chris and locks out perfectly. But it's not just enough to say that it was an absolutely beautiful shield howl. You got to talk at least a little bit about why and how it worked. And the reason it worked really comes down to footwork and timing. Jack threw a pretty typical flat shield howl. Flat meaning that he threw the flat of his blade down and utilized perhaps a little bit the flexibleness of the sword to kind of arc over the top of his opponent's blade and guard. But in another sense, he used the proper shield howl here because he used the flat shield in order to block a cut that was coming in at him from a horizontal angle. The reason you want to throw flat shield howls when someone comes in at you horizontally is, of course, because you want your crossguard pointed towards where your opponent's sword is coming from. If Jack had thrown a typical vertical shield howl, his hands and arms would have been significantly more exposed on his right side, which meant that there was a significantly higher chance that he would have ended up in a double out of his extremely beautiful shield howl. And that's not what you want. When you land one of these, you want that beautiful lockout, that nice thrust, that nice, bend in the sword, and you want your guard to be in a position where you can trap your opponent's blade and force them to go along for the ride of them getting stabbed in the face. So coming into our second exchange, there's a little bit more timidity coming from both fencers, and you know that Chris, on the right here, is absolutely thinking about that shield howl opener again. He needs a solution to what he knows Jack is probably going to throw again, because when something works, well, you do it again. So Jack comes in with another shield howl, this time a little bit more vertical, and Chris does a very interesting parry. He kind of leans over his right leg, throws up a left hanging parry that basically covers that entire line, and the second he feels that contact, he has a little bit of a choice. He's just successfully parried an entry attack, but Jack is still coming at him full bore, and Jack's strategy here, obviously, is that after he misses his shield howl or his shield howl gets parried, you want to end up in a really heavy dominant bind and or grapple, because that's a situation you're probably going to end up in anyway, and if you're the first person to know that the grapple is happening, well, you have the advantage when it does inevitably happen. So Chris has a choice. He has that parry, he got the parry, and now what he's going to do is he's going to feint coming out of his hanger into maybe a right Zwerk, and instead throws another left Zwerk deep to the body of Jack, while then sinking his feet and moving even more a little bit offline to make sure that he's safe from the counter attack. Now, while this happens, and it's a little bit hard to see because of the camera angle, but Jack actually does manage to throw a follow-up Kron howl from his high-handed position towards the head of Chris as he is pivoting off to the side and as Jack is overrunning him towards Chris's left side. So this is a little bit of a complicated situation. If you are in this situation, what happens often is that you parry the entry shield howl, but you aren't necessarily in a position to parry what follows up, because once you finish your shield howl, you're in that high position and you have complete dominance over the high line of your opponent. Chris chose to stay low in order to stay somewhere where Jack couldn't protect himself, and that did work out in the sense that he got a really nice Unterzwerk to the body of Jack. But at the same time, that left hanger position that he ends up staying in pretty much for the entire exchange after he lands his parry isn't necessarily the safest thing of all time. And Jack properly utilizes the principle of overrunning, namely circling around and past his opponent to open up new angles that normally wouldn't be there, and again, does successfully throw a plunging Kron howl right onto the top of his head that I think the judges just kind of missed. In a way, Chris's big parry into big Unterzwerk is a very flashy move. It's very eye-grabbing, and perhaps it simply overshadowed the fact that Jack managed to get an afterblow. Or perhaps the simple fact of the rules is that the afterblow timing was a little bit too tight, and they thought that Jack was out of tempo. Either way, though, it was a really nice exchange and a really nice adaptation coming from the first exchange where Chris just got stabbed in the face. Now for this third exchange, we see another adaptation from both fencers, and that is they both go for the same flat Soohoo. Now this is a really short clip because it's a really short exchange, but one thing to really pay attention to are just the first couple frames of both fencers' Soohoos. And you'll notice that they're both flat, and they both actually make a tiny bit of contact, or at least get very close to making a tiny bit of contact with each other's masks. Meaning, in my mind, that if either one of them had chosen to throw a vertical cut-based Soohoo, that person would have almost assuredly landed. It's one of those simple choices that seems very simple on the offset, but at the end of the day is very, very complicated. And perhaps at the end of the day, both of these fencers thought that they were just going to land that really nice Soohoo on the other person, but in both cases, neither of them threw anything with any kind of horizontal motion, which means that flat Soohoo position didn't really give them any favors. Plus, because they both came forward at the same time, the timing of both of their shots was thrown off a little bit, and neither of them really had the opportunity to plant the tip where they wanted it to go, because it was already past their target by the time it was pulled into measure. Meaning that, again, the vertical Soohoo really dominates in this exact scenario, because you no longer need the point to be the thing that makes contact. You can use any part of the blade after the strong to simply come crashing down onto the head of your opponent, and if they're the one throwing that flat Soohoo, where they're the one who gets nothing and you get the great hit. But, of course, that's not what happened. Instead, they both threw the flat Soohoo, they both missed on the entry, and they both ended up in this really, really high-handed position that we see all the time when people come crashing into one another off of a first intention attack. From this position, both fencers are in completely equal stance. They basically have their feet underneath of them. They're in a perfect situation to Zverkow to any one of 4 openings, and they both do, and they both basically land right against each other. It does appear, though, that Chris put a little bit of a hand push in with his sword before he started his Zverkow, and as a result of that, Jack was just the slightest bit off balance and the slightest bit slower to start the Zvercopter, and as a result, I think that they gave points to Chris and nothing to Jack, but in my opinion, this is just really too tight of a tempo to call as being different, and they both basically just had every opportunity to hit each other, and in some cases, hit each other twice. Now for this next exchange, I'm not sure that anyone really scores any points, but I want to put a special little spotlight on Jack Gassman's footwork here in the purple Gambison. And I want to put special emphasis on it because he does something that you don't see a lot of people do, but was absolutely the right choice in the situation that came up during this exchange. So what happens during this exchange is Jack kind of circles the edge of the ring, ends up switching sides with his opponent. So now he's on the right and Chris is on the left. He comes in with a stepping cut just on his left side, and of course Jack is left-handed, so that results in his left leg ending up forward, and Chris decides to rotate to his left, Jack's right, and basically continue the little bit of the circling pattern. Now, in this particular instance, Jack is sitting with his left leg forward and his dominant arm forward, but his opponent is circling away from his dominant side, meaning that he doesn't have a great opportunity to throw a dominant side cut, but he does have a pretty good opportunity to throw an offside cut. Now, the issue here, or at least the potential issue, is that Chris is circling pretty far to Jack's right, and if Jack were to take a step with his right leg, he would probably find himself in a pretty weak position. He'd have to have his arms crossed over the non-dominant side of his body, attempting to throw some kind of cut and definitely not any kind of thrust, and he would end up in some kind of right hanger position even if he landed, or just a right hanger position to try to defend himself after he thought he landed. And again, this is not a great position to be in. Just like we talked about in the second exchange, where Jack used the principle of overrunning his opponent and going past the defenses that Chris had up, it opens up all kinds of targets when you basically run past the 180-degree line of your opponent's legs. So what Jack does instead is he does a fun little circle shuffle step with both of his feet more or less at the same time that maintains the circling pattern that is already happening in the footwork during this exchange, and it keeps his lead leg forward, it keeps his basically non-dominant side out as a target, and it makes it so that he can continue the exchange without putting his bad side forward and putting himself in a position where he completely has no structure, or he's basically running in a straight line in the wrong direction. It's a really smart piece of footwork that more people need to use in these situations, but a lot of people don't get to use because, frankly, HEMA tournaments end up being a little bit more linear than most people would like to see, I guess. And if you're going to use rotational circling footwork, you have to know how to do it, and this is a great demonstration on how to do it. So for our next exchange, which turns out to be the second to last exchange, we have another little interesting interaction with a Soohoo opener. Jack comes in with his Soohoo opener again, but this time he throws it vertical, thus basically telling me that he learned from the previous time when they both threw that exact same Soohoo and they both came up with nothing. He really intends to trick Chris into coming forward with that flat Soohoo so that he can get the vertical dominance and he can get the points. But it's not what ends up happening here. Instead, Chris falls back on a previous adaptation of going up into his left hanger and throwing another left Zverkow. But it looks like Jack has something in mind for this situation as well, although it doesn't really seem to work out quite so well. And I want to break down a little bit why it didn't work out, but why it wasn't necessarily a bad idea either. So one of the things about going up into a hanging parry is that you have to put your hands really high up, but your sword down really low. And this is great for protecting all kinds of openings. It also means that from that position, Chris is in a great situation to just throw that left Zverkow the second he feels pressure on his blade. But there is a weakness to this situation, and that is that when your hands are really high up in the air, the structure you have in keeping them able to rotate freely is basically zero. And what that means is that when Jack comes in with his vertical edge Soohoo, he ends up in that high bind, and even though Chris's blade is low, he can still manipulate the position and the power of Chris's blade by shoving his hands into Chris's hands. This is a very typical kind of grapple situation you find yourself in all the time, and it's honestly a little bit of bad luck here that it doesn't end up working out for Jack. He clearly is trying to shove his hands into Chris's hands as fast and as hard as he can in order to make sure that the follow-up Zverk that he knows is coming has no momentum and no rotation. However, the reason it doesn't work out is because Chris, either because he knew exactly what Jack was going to try to do, or he just knew he had to get real low if he wanted this to land, sinks so low into his feet that the high position of his hands basically becomes a sub-shoulder position for Jack. Meaning that as Jack is coming forward, he's shoving his hands forward at that high line. He ends up going over the top of Chris's hands, and he misses his window of opportunity to stop that momentum, resulting in him getting Zverked in the body. After he realizes that he has gone a little bit too far and he is now trying to overbind essentially Chris's hands, Jack goes for a little bit of a last-ditch Kronhouse/Crump strike to the top of the head, Chris's head, which is now about 4 feet lower than it normally would be, but also ends up missing over the top because his hands have gone too far forward past his target in order for him to kind of curve it backwards and hit Chris in the head. Also, I think at the end of the day, Jack was also maybe pulling his strike a little bit because it's obvious that the only target he had left available to him was the back of the head or the spine, and in most tournaments that's not legal and also not very nice to do. So for our final exchange, we have another somewhat interesting one, but also kind of anticlimactic interaction. Jack comes in for another Soohoo, as he has done repeatedly, but this time Chris goes low for a little bit of a cheeky leg shot. Now, in my mind, the reason Chris goes for this is because he's so far up on points, it doesn't actually matter what happens in this exchange, and he's just going for something a little bit sneaky while he hopes to get some free points. Of course, going for a leg shot when you pretty much guarantee that your opponent is going to go for a high Soohoo isn't always the best idea, and the result is pretty expected. Jack comes in high, sees that his opponent starts to go low, simply continues the arc of his Soohoo down, touching and hitting the head of Chris, as Chris manages to more or less whiff that leg shot, I think partially because he saw just how close Jack was coming towards his head, and maybe had a little bit of indecision in that moment as to whether or not he should continue his cut or go for the parry. The result is that Jack gets a nice clean 3 points and demonstrates pretty nicely why you don't necessarily want to ever go low when you know your opponent is going to come in at you going high, and Jack gets these clean 3 points, but it's not enough to close the gap to finalize his victory, and Chris ends up being the winner. So, a really interesting fight, a lot of really cool adaptations from both fencers, even though both really had a similar strategy throughout. You can see how they would make slight adjustments to the techniques they were using that were working and not working in certain situations. And it's a great demonstration on how, even though you might come in with that Soohoo every single time on an opening motion, there's still a lot of options for you, even if it gets parried or if it lands. And similarly, if you're the one who's trying to overwhelm someone who is constantly coming in with that entry Soohoo, you have some options. You have some that will work, some that will sometimes work, and some that can get you into a little bit of trouble. So that's all that we're going to have for today. I'll see you next time on Thursday with another fight, and I hope you liked this one.